Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to the ECPR Annual Conference 2021, a kind of Wiley session, the publishing landscape, open research, transitional deals and political science. My name is Dr. Lizzie Brophy. I'm a publisher at Wiley and I'll be kind of emceeing this event. This is a Q&A panel and I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, who I've just realized a lot of you, I've only ever written your names. I've never actually said them out loud. So I apologize if I pronounce them incorrectly. So if you could kind of just say hi as I kind of go through you so that everyone knows who you are. So we've got Adam Sheingate, who is the co-editor of the journal Governance.
Hi, everybody.
We have Bruce McDonald, who's the editor-in-chief of Public Administration.
Hi, how are you doing?
We have Jens Blom Hansen, the co-editor of Scandinavian Political Studies.
Hello, everybody.
And Johanna Hornung, co-editor of European Policy Analysis and Review of Policy Research.
Hi, everyone.
As I said, there's also me, Lizzie Brophy from Wiley. My colleague, Mike Streeter, is also on the call as well, who will be here to jump in if anything goes wrong with me, and also obviously can help support any questions people might have for us in relation to publishing. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
So before we kind of jump into the Q&A session part, first I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we're having this session and give you a little bit of background and some kind of data and some information so we all stay on the same page. So I think a lot of us know that open access has become a bigger and bigger part of the discussion around publishing, academic publishing, research funding over the last few years. And of course that has become a major element and is one of the reasons why we're doing this. But I think it's interesting to show a little bit about how that is being reflected within political science, public administration and policy research. So for that, I've got a little bit of data to show you. Now, as you know, all data comes with caveats. This was taken from Dimensions. It focuses on the field of research subjects, political science and policy and administration. And this is only showing articles, it doesn't include books, chapters, etc. But you can see from this graph that over the last 10 years, essentially, the amount of articles published in these subjects has almost doubled. Now, it really jumped in 2020. 2020 was a special year. We'll have to wait and see if it continues. But this graph is still showing a really clear increase year on year. Essentially, more articles are being published in these subjects now than there have ever been before. When we break that down into the open access, we can see that open access, which is this green line, which is all open access, has also been following a similar trajectory. Gold open access, which is what a lot of us think of when we talk about open access in general, has more than tripled. It's gone from being less than 5,000 articles published open access in these subjects in 2012 to nearly 20,000. That's a huge increase. And of course, it's just reflective of what's been going on in the wider industry and in the subject. And of course, this is why we think that it's actually really important for us to talk about it and to be able to get opinions from our esteemed colleagues here. Before we jump in again, I just want to very quickly go over a few definitions because I just want to make sure everyone is really clear on what we're talking about as we're going to be throwing around various terms. So I just want to make sure people are clear on what we're talking about. I've got a definition of open access here, which is from the Declaration of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which is a little bit old now, but it's still, I think, really, really relevant. And it clarifies it as being available on the public internet. It is any user can read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, link to any of these texts, and that they are accessible without any financial, legal, or technical barriers. And those really are some of the three key things about an open access article. I've also got a little definition about open research, which sometimes is also known as open science. It is the practice of science in where research data, lab notes, and anything to do with the research process is made available, again, in very much the same way as open access. Okay. And then I've just got a couple of other definitions for you, just so again, we're all on the same page. Gold open access is when the article is made free immediately upon publication, usually due to a payment of an APC, and it uses a Creative Commons license. Green open access is usually when the article is made free after an embargo period. Transitional agreements, which is something you may have heard discussed a lot recently, is an agreement between an institution and a publisher, and it's aimed at moving from subscription agreement arrangement to open access. Essentially, instead of paying for access to read content, it moves it to paying for access to publish that content and to make that content open access, freely available in the way we've just said. There are lots of other types of open access. You might hear bronze, diamond, platinum. We're not really going to engage with those today, but just so you know that those exist. But primarily when people just say open access, they mean gold open access. If you have any questions throughout the session, please just pop them in the chat and we'll come to them later. And I think without further ado, I am going to open up the first question to our panelists. And my first question is, what are your thoughts on the move towards open access in relation to journals as both editors and researchers? And I'm going to suggest that maybe Adam answers that first, just because he is at the top of the list as the A.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Lizzie, for organizing this panel, and thanks everybody for joining. I mean, I must say that a lot of what we're talking about today is really operating in the background of publishing. And so my experience as an editor, I've been the editor or co-editor of Governance since 2018. During that time, these developments have been taking place, but it hasn't really been visible to me from the editorial side. We have seen an increase in submissions. We've been publishing more, looking at the data just for governance. We certainly are publishing more open access, but, and I think this is a good thing, that's really not been visible or noticeable from the editorial side. And I think as it should be. And so I think, you know, there may be other questions that folks have, I think more from the institutional side or from the author side. I should also say, you know, we don't have publishing fees in our journal. Again, that's not very common in political science either. So I think in many respects, the conversation that we're having today is really more about the publishing landscape than the editorial landscape, although maybe my colleagues have different views on that.
Would someone else from the panel like to chime in on that question?
Yeah, I think I agree that it affects us more as researchers rather than as editors. But so let me offer some thoughts as an editor, but also as a researcher. I think open access involves a lot of benefits and some important drawbacks. One of the main benefits is, of course, that research is available to everybody. And I think that you, like me, often get approached by researchers over ResearchGate, typically researchers from the third world who would like to see a copy of some article, and I'm happy to provide that. But that would be much easier if everything was on open access. So that's a big benefit. I think the main drawbacks are twofold. One is who can afford to pay the publication fee. I mean, us in the Anglo-Saxon world, I think we are all on the safe side. We can either pay ourselves or have our universities pay. But what about the brilliant Pakistani scholar who is employed at a low wage at a poor university in Pakistan? How does he get his research published? I think there's an important distributional concern there. Another implication I worry a bit about is nowadays journals act as gatekeepers, and if you get published, it's a kind of quality stamp on your research. But if journals, publishers start earning money depending on the amount of articles they publish, there'll be a dangerous temptation to pressure editors to accept more articles simply to earn more money. And I worry a bit about that.
I'll admit I hadn't actually thought much about it from the side of being pressured to accept in the incentive to publish more, so the more it comes in. but I definitely agree there's some concern about access and the diversity of what we publish from the perspective of open access, and not just somebody from a third world country, whether it's Pakistan or someplace else, but even smaller institutions in the United States or in Europe who don't necessarily have the money set aside for faculty to pay to publish open access, or it forces the faculty member to have to kind of choose, are they going to spend all of their disposable cash one year to publish? I mean, there's definitely some universities are able to do that more than others. And so it creates almost different tiers of universities and different tiers of the scholars. And some of the most interesting stuff comes from some of those people who are at institutions that might not have the resources others do. I think open access is great, but I think the cost does pose some concerns along the way.
Yeah, I would also add to that maybe both with regard to the diversity of authorship. This can definitely be a problem if there are open access fees that not everyone is able to pay. But I would also add the conflict that might arise regarding the ethical standards of universities and publishing houses. So universities and research institutions are often funded by public money, and then the results that are produced by the research are not available to the public anymore. While of course, publishing houses do need to earn money or be remunerated in some way or another. That also poses a question to how we should disseminate the research. We've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic that many subscriptions have been set out in a way that research on COVID-19 was also available to everyone who wanted to read it. And I think that is really important, especially when it comes to most pressing topics such as COVID-19. But I think we have to find a solution for making research also available to a wider audience by at the same time ensuring that everyone who's working in this business is also remunerated adequately.
Thanks. Any other thoughts in relation to the kind of opening question just around open access? That's fine. I am going to kind of then move on to another question that you've kind of raised almost in talking about this, and that is in relation to kind of diversity. How do we reconcile the kind of OA agenda and our requirement to and our desire to diversify authorship? At the moment, open access is very much a European-driven program. So how do we do you have any thoughts as to how we do kind of bring these two sides together?
I mean, I would, oh, go ahead, please.
No, please, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, very briefly that, the diversity question is a broader one, that obviously is intersecting with the questions of open access. And I think, as my colleagues have brought up quite compellingly, that the differentials in resources obviously are going to make the challenge greater. I guess I would just say, again, from the perspective of an editor, my co-editor and I, it's part of our editorial discussions that we have with one another. How do we continue to diversify this? Again, particularly when we think about the sources of the manuscripts that we receive. And my experience has been that because of the way in which these open access agreements are operating in the background very much, it's difficult for us to know how it might be affecting the types of submissions that we get. Having said that, we have seen an increase in some types of diversity around submissions, and then on the other hand, we have no idea. I mean, we see that our the number of downloads are going up, but we don't really have a granular sense of how diverse that readership might be. So I guess my theme here is that you know, for editors, we might need more information about how these agreements are affecting our journals, basically.
No, I think that's a good point. Being able to understand who and where the people are coming from that are actually publishing it through the open access for the journals, kind of helps us to understand what diversity impacts actually might be. Part of me kind of thinks that there might be some middle ground solution almost where, an editor might have, an application process to where you can apply to have your article be open access if you're from certain communities or from smaller schools, or you don't necessarily have the resources, and editors can make maybe a dozen or whatever exceptions per year to make an article open access in order to increase that diversity of submissions. But it's hard to know necessarily, because when something comes through, I don't know that it's going to be open access until I can actually see it on the website at the end of the whole process. So it's hard to know when that decision happens, who's involved, or how much or how little resources the people who are wanting to publish open access are able to. That said, I think publishing open access is remarkably important. The things that we do, the things that we publish have a public interest in them, between political science and public administration and public policy. So trying to figure out a way to increase that access so that those who might not necessarily have the resources are able to still make it open and available is probably a good thing for us to try and figure out.
Let me add a thought upon that. I think that if journals completely switch the business model to open access, it's the same as excluding parts of the world from publishing their research. So the big question to me is, how do you find the correct mix of open access and non-open access within the individual journals?
Yeah, adding to the question of diversity, what I also think is that especially the established journals have a tendency to publish really homogeneous articles, at least of what regards structure and state-of-the-art reporting. And this largely also stems from an Anglo-Saxon socialization, I think. If we look at the research that is generated in other parts of the world, or also in other even European countries, for example, they have different research traditions partly. And I think one part of diversity, even apart from third world countries, is also to engage in a dialogue among these different research traditions that we also have within countries, to foster that and to also enable different approaches maybe to research, and give them a platform in the journals, and by at the same time ensuring the quality that is necessary for publication.
Okay, and kind of again, following off that you mentioned, you kind of mentioned the agreements. I think Adam and Bruce, you kind of mentioned the agreements that publishers are making, these transitional agreements. And I just wondered, what do you think are the benefits and the advantages? Perhaps, again, as researchers, if you feel like you don't really see it as an editor, or maybe that is a disadvantage in itself. So what do you think about these kind of transitional agreements, either kind of as a concept or as something that is being put into practice by publishers such as Wiley, Elsevier, CUP, etc.?
Well, I think we definitely see an increase in submissions by people who are part of institutions that have these transitional agreements. It is even the case that in some cases we observe that the corresponding author, who's the main reason for, or the one who has to be affiliated with the eligible institution, that this decision who will be corresponding author depends on whether the institution has a transitional agreement. And we do think that it makes an impact on who will submit articles and who will then also publish open access. But again, I think, and this is also what the others already raised, this is also a challenge for diversity, because not all institutions have these agreements, and those who do not will then fall even farther back in the publishing landscape, maybe.
Yeah, let me add to that. I think these transitional agreements are fine in principle for the countries that can afford them, because it takes the whole problem away, so to speak, from the individual researcher. But my worry is, again, the parts of the world that cannot afford these agreements. What do they do?
And I guess to follow on a little bit from that, I guess the question is, what do we say to funders that are kind of insisting on open access, and other groups that are insisting authors publish open access, but perhaps are not necessarily providing the funds or are relying on these agreements or on institutions to kind of get open access out there to kind of create this transition?
Well, I think if you think of a funder like the ERC, the EU Research Council, who at least sometimes insist that you publish under open access conditions, there in your grant there'll be money to pay the submission fee or the publication fee. So that's sort of, the problem is solved in that respect. But I think it's sort of an individual solution to a collective problem, so to speak.
No, I think it's a little bit of a challenge. I mean, I had a grant that I did a couple of years ago where I submitted the grant, I was offered the grant and I turned it down, in part because they wanted the information published open access, but they weren't willing to cover the costs. And they were expecting my institution to cover, but my institution's the exact same way. They don't have the funds, and they expect the publisher who wants, or the grantor who wants the work done, to cover the cost. So, there are definitely times when organizations are kind of trying to, everybody wants the open access, but it's almost the burden of who has to pay for it that comes down at the end of the day. And I think that's, goes back to some of those challenges that we've talked about, that we might all like the idea of having the open access, but some institutions have more resources than others. And so where does the responsibility fall? In terms of transactional agreements, I actually didn't even know about them and that they existed, I think, until Lizzie, you told me about them a couple months ago. But I've never been in an institution that has one. And some of them exist, but a lot of us are institutions that we don't have any of those kind of agreements. And so up until our institutions are part of that, I'm at a large institution. We have 45,000 students, part of a fairly large network of universities. If I went to my department and said, I need X amount to publish open access, I would get, well, we would all like to have that, but where does the funding for it come from? And so it's very much, these agreements exist, but at least from the side of the US, I think we almost need more of them to be in place so that more universities have access, or more faculty have access to be able to publish in that regards.
I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add other than, something that maybe we haven't discussed here, which is the role that preprints play in this discussion, which is the way that authors have, continue to have copyright over preprints prior to publication. And, this is all very ad hoc. I haven't had any individual experience as an editor where this has come up, but we all know that this is one of the ways in which scholars, navigate this landscape around open access and generally the dissemination of work. And then some institutions are, UC Berkeley, my own institution has tried it a little bit, but providing, developing platforms precisely for the dissemination of preprints by scholars that then, makes research available. Although, as I think it was Jans who pointed out at the beginning, I mean, these arrangements also tend to reinforce the inequalities that have already that previously have existed with across these institutions. So those concerns don't go away, but that's just another dimension to this issue that we might want to consider.
Thanks. And kind of, I guess, actually kind of following on from the kind of discussion about preprints, obviously I mentioned kind of open research as like a wider term, particularly thinking about kind of open data, transparent peer review. And of course, they're not directly, they don't have to be related to open access, but they very much are. And I was just wondered what your thoughts are around these, around the kind of move towards open data, different areas of open research, transparent peer review, and again the fact that it seems quite clear that within, you know, political science, public administration, policy, different regions, different groups seem to be moving at different pace, different speeds, and taking different approaches to this. And I wondered what your thoughts are on those.
Well, again, I would say it's open data is a phenomenon that is difficult to be against as a principle, I think. But again, I think we should think about potential distributional implications, because it's a principle that is easier to apply to some types of research than other types. It's easier to apply to lab research and quantitative research, and more difficult to apply to qualitative research, where interviews may be given on the promise of anonymity and so on. And I think that may feed into the prestige of published research. That research that is published under open data condition is more prestigious than research that is not. And this feeds into evaluation of researchers in hiring situations and promotion situations. So I think it may have some distributional concerns, distributional implications that we may like or not like, depending on where you stand as a researcher.
I agree. There's been a rather animated discussion in political science about data access and research transparency, and precisely on this cleavage of you know, quantitative versus qualitative scholarship, and quite a thoughtful and developed response from qualitative researchers about the types of challenges that Jan's just mentioned. My own experience as an editor has been that we've gradually moved the journal toward a more, I guess, proactive stance with regard to data access and how we interact with our authors, where I'd say particularly when it comes to the kind of quantitative work that we publish, that we're increasingly discouraging authors from the traditional data available upon request type of statement. And as an editor, I strongly encourage authors to use a data archiving platform, whether that's Dataverse or Figshare or ICPSR. And the way I encourage them is to say that you know, this will assign a DOI to your data, and that will perhaps, you know, increase the likelihood that it's cited and could be more useful that way. And most authors who do that type of work are interested in pursuing that type of data access. And then for qualitative researchers, I just work with my authors, and you know, it's been important to my co-editor and I, and Wiley has been quite supportive of this, that we retain editorial discretion to make the decisions on a paper by paper basis about what would be an appropriate type of transparency, particularly as it relates to qualitative work. And so that's been how we've addressed it. The issue of Lizzie, I think you mentioned this issue of review transparency, and this is also something that I actually never heard of before. And I don't have a well formulated view on it because I'm not quite familiar with it, but it strikes me as sort of a solution in search of a problem. I don't really understand what the value added of turning an anonymous peer review process into an open process, unless I'm misunderstanding what it really means. But maybe for those of you who have more experience with this, I'd like to hear more about it. But at the moment, I don't really see the value it brings to the editorial process or to the peer review process.
I'll just give a quick definition of transparent peer review. And essentially, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's that not only are things no longer anonymized, but that generally the review will be maybe published or made available alongside the article in order to kind of show how debates and how the article can develop. So yeah, that's a very basic definition. Just so.
I've seen some journals from healthcare that do the open reviews. And one of the things I like about it is that you can see almost from the initial submission, what was done, the changes over time. The quality of the reviews is then very high because you have an incentive that your name's going to be published out there, that you did this review. And so you end up with a very detailed, very engaged process of kind of refining the manuscript. I absolutely love the idea. My always concern comes back to it's hard enough to find reviewers right now to review manuscripts. What does it mean for a field when you start, publishing who it is along the way? Does that make it harder to find reviewers or not? I would imagine it would probably kind of change that and make it a little bit even more difficult to find reviewers. I don't know if in the healthcare, the fields that do have that open process, if they pay their reviewers to kind of incentivize them along the way, or how they actually get people to engage in that open side. But I love the idea because I think, research does its best when everything is open and out front in public.
Yeah, I agree in principle, but I completely also agree with the worry that, or the concern that this will increase the reviewer fatigue problem. It will make it much more difficult to recruit reviewers, and I think it will start a debate on whether reviewing should be paid, which if the job is getting harder, is not something you can understand, I think.
Yeah, adding to that directly also, I definitely share the point that it's great to see how journals and editors are encouraging authors to share their data, and I think this is also something that the publishing houses really encourage as well. And I think every journal by now has a statement on that, in which it says what it prefers. But I also think that open data is not the only solution to that problem of transparency, because just because data is available does not mean that data gathering or methods are transparent, or that also the research process is transparent. So that kind of connects to the question also of how the review process should be organized. Of course, it would also be great to have the option for reviewers to comment on progress, like in preprints, or also see how a paper develops and better understand how the research results came or developed by engaging with the authors in a dialogue. But of course, you also have to find reviewers for that, who are open for that. And I think giving credit to reviewers is really the biggest challenge that one has. I think there are also great developments in this regard. For example, the Publons initiative, Publons strategy to also give credit to reviewers, who then can use that for their job interviews, or also in the academic discussion. But I think I also remember numbers that said that a very small percentage of all researchers actually does review papers. And that then again also brings us to the question of gatekeeping again. Like if you have a very small group of researchers who's doing the main percentage of reviews, then these kind of determine what will be published and what not. And for that reasons, I think transparent peer review and also giving people the option to comment on research and to have really open discussion with the authors as well on research processes and how the results were developed would be a very great development in the future. But I would not abandon the standard of peer review in that case, although one could also consider that double-blind peer review, although it is the gold standard, is not often or does not work in that way oftentimes, because papers are sometimes not really anonymous because they're on conference websites, for example, or they also are from authors who know each other quite well. It's familiar who's working in a certain field. And that is then an open review kind of as well. So I think the development in the direction of more transparency would be a good one to follow as well.
And kind of, again, following on from that, I mean, what do you think the potential impact of, I would say both open research and open access, but maybe we'll start with open research first, because and open data and these things, because that's what we've been talking about. You know, what do you think the impact of these things might be on kind of the discipline at large, and specifically on perhaps the journals you're editing?
I mean, again, just speaking from my own experience in you know, political science is such a diverse field, and as I think as Johanna mentioned earlier, I mean, it just depends on the type of work that we're talking about. I mean, so for example, you know, we're beginning to see in governance, as we've seen throughout political science, is, you know, a greater turn towards experimental work, and it's, you know, becoming more common for you know, experimental work to include the, you know, the pre-study submissions that you know, the pre-registration of experiments, and so, you know, these are things that we haven't really formalized in our review process or publication process, but, you know, authors can, you know, make those available. And I guess my you know, my interest and concern as an editor is that that we're preserving the diversity of the field, and that we are gatekeepers, obviously, but it's difficult to avoid that role as an editor, but that we do that in a way that doesn't systematically exclude certain types of work. And I guess that's always been the concern around these efforts to standardize what we mean by research transparency or data access. And the reason why, you know, before I became an editor, I was very resistant to the whole DART move. As an editor, my view has changed so much just because I've been exposed to more and different types of research, but I think it's still essential for editors to understand how any systematization or standardization will have differential impacts on types of work, types of scholars, and that we are very careful in that regard and take our responsibilities seriously.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think we should realize that everything dealing with open research and open data appeals much more to certain types of research than other types of research, much more to experimental, quantitative research than qualitative research. And I think that will slowly feed into the way we think about research and the prestige of doing different kinds of methodological designs. It will feed into how we evaluate job applications, how we evaluate promotion situations and things like that. So, and that may be a good thing. I'm not certain what I think about that aspect, but it's something that we should think about because it has real consequences.
I find it hard to predict what would happen if we make peer review more transparent and more open to anyone to comment on papers as well. I think there would also be a divide maybe between people who would be really engaged in this endeavor and would really read a lot of papers and comment on them, and others who then might also not do that anymore, maybe also because it's not it's open and transparent, and it's not that they are directly asked for their opinion anymore, as it is now in the review process. And I'm also not sure at the moment what would be the best way to ensure the quality of research in the long term, whether it would be better to have everything open for everyone, or whether to still have this gatekeeping function, which, as Adam already pointed out, is I think also really taken seriously by editors and also reviewers, at least in the most part.
I mean, and I guess the kind of natural question and that kind of follows on from all of this is kind of, so what do you think we need to think about next? What is it, do you think, that kind of maybe publishers or the discipline or kind of edit, what do we need to think about next in relation to kind of open access and open research? What do we need to kind of, what do editors need to know? What areas do we really need to focus on so that we can kind of move in a positive direction for the discipline?
I think that the most sort of urgent issues to me to concern, what to think about would be to think about whether journals should aim for being all open access, or for being a mix of open access and non-open access, in order to deal with the distributional concerns that we've talked about earlier. So that would be one sort of urgent concern. Another would be to increase the use of transitional agreements. I think it takes away the individual problem for researchers in the countries that have them. So the more we can get of those, the better. And then we'll have to deal at a later stage with the rest of the world, so to speak, but leave some parts of journals open for non-open access for researchers in those countries to have a chance of publishing their research.
Just, I think, moving back to the question of reviews and whether reviewers should be paid. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and it would be interesting to see what the financial implications of such a move would be, but maybe that would require a degree of transparency from the publisher that is not as popular as as we might think. So, but it is intriguing. I think it is something that that maybe in political science we're eventually going to have to confront.
As much as I don't like to admit it, I think going to the idea of how do we figure out the issue of dealing with reviewers, is something that's kind of forcing a lot of journals to think about whether it's paying them or what have you. I think the downside of what people don't realize about that some fields do pay the reviewers, but you have to also pay to submit. And so it's kind of a two-sided thing that there's a large movement on Twitter of people from public administration who are very much against reviewing unless they get paid for it. And I'm like, well, I understand the point, but you're forgetting there's this other side of we're not charging you to submit either. And so it's becoming a challenge of how do we find the reviewers who are willing and open to engaging because of that pushback that we're starting to get.
Yeah, I think an important point is, the first step is to be aware of the problems that there are, or of the challenges that we face as journal editors, but also as researchers, in making our articles available to the public and to also other researchers who are working in the field, and also to students. I think one of the major challenges also is when we teach in our fields, that students also have a hard time researching or searching for literature and then citing it when they do not have access to it because their universities do not have the subscriptions to that research. So to be aware of these challenges is, I think, the first step, and then also to engage in discussions on the question how we can address that, how we maybe also can organize funding for open access. For example, with the European Policy Analysis Journal, we have a best paper award that we give to an author team every year, and this article is then made free access, not open access, but freely available for the period of 1 year, and to provide such incentives to maybe also fund free access of articles. That might be developments that one could foster further. And then also regarding the open research and transparent reviews, I think that it will be a question of the future, how the peer review process also will develop. And I think there are also initiatives, I already mentioned Publons, but there are certainly other means to also give credit to reviewers except for financial incentives, because I think academics also function according to attention and reward in the academic world, kind of. And if you are a person who has done a lot of reviews, that might also be considered something worthy for the discipline.
So does anyone have anything else they would like to kind of raise or comment on in relation to what we've been discussing? So I am now going to open it up to questions. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please do pop them in the chat. I'm just going to pop in a couple of links to explain a bit more about transition agreements so people can have a look at those. So yeah, let us know if you've got any questions for the panel about this subject, or perhaps something else. Of course, if no one has any questions, that would also be fine. Wait, sorry, Mike, were you gonna ask something?
Well, I thought I would. I didn't see any questions in the chat. And can you hear me okay? Yeah. And so again, I'm Mike Streeter. I'm Lizzie's counterpart from the US as a publisher in political science. And so I thought maybe I would have a question for the panel too, if no one from the audience has one that might kind of instigate a little bit more discussion. And having listened to the comments that have sort of come through on the different sort of forms of both open access and open research, I mean, one comment I'd make, at least from the publisher side of things, is that all the journals represented on this panel are hybrid journals, in that they're publishing both a mix of subscription content and open access content. So at least from a publisher's point of view, there's no requirement for authors to publish open access in the journals, but it is an option, and an option in a sense that we don't want to not have the option to publish open access for journals that are required to do so, maybe from a funder or from their institution. But we've also talked about sort of different forms of open research, and so that aren't necessarily related to the article of record. So we've talked about registered reports, we've talked about data deposition and replication and transparency, and clearly that's not something that's applicable across all different sorts of methods. But maybe a question for the panel as we kind of consider these different routes is, either as a researcher or as an editor or as a sort of representative of your institution, can you talk about any current incentives that you might see from your institution that go beyond simply publishing in a peer-reviewed academic journal? Are there incentives, say, to publish in a registered reports format or submit in a registered reports format? Are there incentives to make your data open, that kind of thing? So a question about like the different sort of systems and the incentivizing that's available. And maybe that's a question for the panel or anyone else that's in the audience as well, because it looks like we have representation from a fairly diverse group.
I mean, I'll take a crack at it, Mike. I mean, if I understand you correctly, I mean, sort of, you're also asking what you know, as a researcher, and I guess just speaking personally, I mean, I come from a department that is still very much focused on books, frankly. So, you know, the conversation about, you know, journal, the varieties of sort of research output and how that interacts in the journal world, even though the discipline at large is, I guess you could say that journal articles are the coin of the realm for the discipline at large. You know, different parts of political science are still very book driven, and I happen to be in a department that is book driven. And I guess that does relate back to my journal that I'm representing here today, is that we still publish book reviews, and that's a sort of you know, something that we can continue to do, and I think is continued to be very much valued by our readers, and is also an important part of the academic you know, academic advancement for scholars as they rise through the ranks. Particularly, again, I think in political science, there's still a high expectation that in the United States, there's a high expectation that that junior scholars will publish their dissertation in book form. That's changing somewhat, but part of the advancement and promotion process then relies on not just the publication of the book, but the reception of the book. And that includes things like the reviews of the book in journals. And so you know, part of what we're doing as a I mean, something that we all know, but just to make explicit, is that our journal then plays a role in this larger, you know, kind of process of scholarly advancement. And so that's just adding another like wrinkle to this conversation about what is the role of the journal and open access and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. And I don't know of any department in my country, which is Denmark, that has any sort of explicit incentives of the kind that you mentioned. But I think the way it works, it would be surprising if that happened, I think. The way it works is that this sort of subtly influences the way we think about research, and thus influences our informal evaluation standards, and influences the way hiring committees evaluate applicants, influences the way PhD assessment committees work. And if you are a young researcher wanting to make a career in academia, you're very aware of these things, and you orient yourself accordingly, and you make your choices of which type of research to do based on those thoughts. So I think it has real consequences.
Yeah, I can only say that I, at least in my university, also do not have any of these incentives to publish anywhere else. And I also see the transition from monographs to cumulative dissertations that are probably also a reason why journals are becoming more and more important, also compared to publishing houses, maybe. Because that's just how the publishing landscape develops, or is developing now. And I think also that universities have very different requirements towards their staff. So some universities, especially those that are really active in their region or connected also to companies, for example, or at least involved in some kind of political advice, maybe, that these also have different requirements of their research staff, that they should also engage in regional projects, for example, or work together with companies or with regional actors to foster the region. And I think that there is really a challenge and maybe also a difficult task for researchers to respond both to the requirements of universities, of funders, and then of the international community to publish in high-ranked journals.
Yeah, I'll mention my institution doesn't have any incentives either, but we quite frequently, coming to the journal, have people from primarily some of the Asian countries who their institutions have the incentive of, if you're publishing, for it to count, it needs to be in a journal that is in SSCI. And occasionally it'll be something in Scopus, which the journal that, public administration's in both. So for us, that's not a problem. But I know for a lot of the journals who are open access in the field, they aren't necessarily in SSCI. And there's a challenge of how do you get more journals into SSCI that has emerged in order to kind of accommodate for this increased demand from some of the Asian communities to publish in journals that are only listed there. I think that's created a little bit of a challenge, but it's also created that challenge in regards of this large influx of research coming from one part of the world, and is very incentivized, very driven for your journals because of that. So how do we kind of treat that when we have the rest of the world doesn't necessarily have that same drive? It's kind of just a very, very weird position to kind of be in, seeing it all play out as people submit to the journals.
And kind of following up on something that Adam mentioned, actually, I have a question. Obviously, when we do talk about open access and transitional agreements, this is all about research articles. And whilst research articles is undoubtedly one of the main forms of communication, one of the main kind of content types that journals publish, obviously Adam mentioned that the journal publishes book reviews. It's not the only type of content that journals publish. And I was wondering what the panel thinks about kind of the fact that, the focus has been so closely on kind of just articles and not other types of published content published by journals. And when, this other type of content is really, really common, especially amongst social science journals.
I think the biggest problem in that regard is the influence on citation metrics and on the impact factors, because book reviews and also other types of publications that are not original articles usually are not really contributive to your impact factor. And I think that's one of the main problems, and also maybe the reason why many journals do not publish book reviews or other types of publications anymore.
Could I comment on that as well, Lizzie, if that's okay? And well, I sort of take this back to the point that Bruce made about the SSCI, the JCR, and how that kind of can impact submissions, and then all these questions too about citation metrics and how they're used in evaluation. And I don't think there's anyone from Clarivate Analytics on this call that would sort of raise a red flag if we started talking about the relevance of the impact factor. But I'm curious, because it's something that we as publishers think about too. The impact factor is a journal level metric. It doesn't do an excellent job of sort of expressing the value of the individual research article, although you could look at citation counts for a particular paper. But the impact factor as one thing representative of a journal kind of driving submissions, does it, what's your view on its sort of its lifespan? Is it, clearly it's relevant, and it can be relevant as far as attracting submissions. Journal authors want to be publishing in high impact factor journals, and tenure committees will look at whether or not an author is publishing in high impact factor journals. But there's no right answer to this question. I mean, I think it's what's the longevity of this thing? Can that type of a metric and measure be applicable in the future as we're seeing the amount of output increase? And is there opportunity for this sort of change in how research assessment is done, and not necessarily getting rid of the impact factor, but maybe not making it as prominent as it is in considerations?
I mean, this is a great question, and we can get into a whole discussion of metrics and how that's shaped our world. And my personal experience, I mean, it's as a journal editor, it's very difficult to ignore metrics about your journal, whether that's the impact factor or the rankings or whatever. My journal is associated with a part of the International Political Science Association, the structure of governance, and so there's a board that my co-editor and I serve at the pleasure of that board, and fortunately our board is not that concerned about the impact factor of the journal. But if I had to say one thing, I would say, if there was somebody from Clarivate on here, I'd say, if you could just eliminate the 2-year impact factor. It's just get rid of it as a metric. And a 5-year impact factor, I think, is a more appropriate, at least in the social sciences, a more appropriate metric if we feel like we need to have a metric. And it is a way of summarizing the average citations of the things that we publish. Now, given the transitions that are occurring in the calculation of the impact factor, and the transition itself is so complicated in terms of what was counted last year and what's being counted this year and what will be counted next year, and that has to relate to the increase of online publications and so forth. The 2-year impact factor is meaningless for the next 2 years. So maybe that's a good thing. I mean, because maybe that actually will discourage people, or not discourage, I guess. Maybe it will increase the skepticism people have about the metric as being of value, which in the short term would be a good thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think every journal sits there, and as editors, we probably stare at the impact factors in our scope of site scores probably more than we ever really should. I mean, they're there, people pay attention to them, so they matter to a certain degree. For me, thinking about things like our altmetric scores actually become more interesting or more important. Understanding how people are engaging with the research, whether it's being talked about on Twitter or on Reddit, or if it's being covered in news media. For me, that's what I'm interested in. So if I can have a paper, it might not get cited a whole lot, but it's really impactful in other ways, then I don't care that it's not going to get cited a lot. I want the papers coming in that are impactful. And so, figuring out and trying to have conversations with people on why something besides impact factor matters is a little bit of a challenge, because we've all been ingrained for so long that impact factor rules everything. But I think those altmetric scores are at least a start in a right direction for saying there's other influences of what we publish that really matters. It's just how to get everybody else to really understand what those are and how it's calculated is a little bit of a challenge.
Let me add to that. I'm a bit schizophrenic about the impact factors. On the one hand, I'm keenly aware of the impact factor of my small journal and how it develops and how it's going. On the other hand, I also realize that there are limits to how much influence I have on the way the impact factor develops, because I'm here for a limited period of time. I'm a small regional journal. No matter how well I do my job, my impact factor is not going to increase to the levels of the American Political Science Review. So I sort of reconcile myself to the job of doing something, doing the job of as an editor as well as I can, make sure that the articles I accept are of high quality, and then the impact factor is secondary to that, sort of at least in my daily life.
Yeah, in my opinion, this also kind of adds to the question of diversity that we had earlier. I think that Clarivate Analytics is as a private firm, which kind of has a great impact into the academic world. This is really an interesting setting, I would say, at least. And adding to that, I would say that especially the fact that Clarivate Analytics is basically deciding on which journals are good, or at least good enough to be included in such a closed shop, which it is. There has not been much change in the last years, or there is not that much change in adding journals to the list, or even deleting journals from the list. I know journals which I do not want to name, but which alone from their just looking at their organization of the review process would not really deserve to be included in that list, and others which are maybe a little newer or not that established yet, but which do a really good job, both in terms of having an editorial board with people who are really excellent scholars, having an editorial team that is really of high quality, and also doing their job really in a really great fashion, and having good authors, and they're not included in that. So this is something I'm always wondering, why the academic world is so determined by in fact a private company. So I do also think that this is something we should consider, and there are also other scores, for example, the Scopus site score, which is, I think, also gaining a little more prominence and relevance in the field. But it is still the case that the SSCI certainly has a great impact, also because universities require, for example, PhD students to publish in these journals that are listed to get their PhD. And that's, I think, also something where universities have to be a little more open towards maybe other journals that are rated according to different standards.
And if I can just kind of ask, this is following up on something Bruce mentioned, because Bruce, you specifically pulled out the altmetrics and kind of impact, and talking about impact beyond beyond academia, not just the impact factor, but talking about beyond that. And I'm wondering kind of what your thought is on what the potential for open access could do in relation to looking at these alternative metrics, and in relation to kind of trying to achieve that impact, which is something which I think is growing in importance, not just in relation to kind of personal importance for researchers. Arguably, that's always been important, but in relation to how people kind of do measure research and the, I'm going to put air quotes, value of research. So I wondered if you could maybe comment a bit more on that.
I think having open research definitely contributes to better altmetrics, and better altmetrics kind of helps get, whether it's sharing that there's research going on, or almost an apple before the horse or cart before the horse kind of issue. If you have something that's open, it's easier for people to see it, so there's going to be more conversation around it, and we definitely see that in the readership numbers of manuscripts. If it's an open article, they get read a lot more. They get the diversity of where people are reading it increases. The engagement between local media and the article starts to increase because they can actually sit there and go, okay, here's something that's being written about from somebody in our community. We can actually read the full paper without having to try and figure out how to get access. So the potential impact for what we publish starts to increase rapidly when it's open. And that rapid impact is what really shows on the alt metric that doesn't show in an impact factor.
Okay, are there any more questions for the panel, or from the panel to each other, of course? The awkward thing about being in a digital space, I'm just kind of waiting to see if something pops up or somebody's mute button comes off. Okay, I think if there isn't, then I think we could probably wrap up and everyone can get 15 minutes of their day back, which is super exciting. I'd like to thank the panelists, so Adam, Bruce, Jens, and Johanna. I thought that was really, really interesting. Thank you for taking out your time out to do this, particularly Adam and Bruce, where it's very, very early in the morning. So thank you for coming down and doing this. Yeah, I think that was really, really interesting. Obviously, I've put some links to transition agreement information in the chat. If anyone does have any further questions, please feel free to contact me. And I'm sure the members of the panel will be happy to kind of talk to anybody who would like to know more. But otherwise, thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Thank
Nice
you.
to see you. Bye.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Bye, Tara. Bye.